Hello, my name is Jared Ludlow, Publications Director at the BYU Religious Studies Center. Today I'm joined by Don Bruger, one of the editors here at the center, and we're here to talk about some possible resources that can accompany your Come Follow Me reading for October 16th through 22nd, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. The first one we'll look at is called The Occasional Nature, Composition, and Structure of Paul's Letters. It's by Eric Huntsman, an ancient scripture faculty member at BYU. It comes from a Sperry Symposium volume. And this article basically gives an overview of different letters from Paul and how he wrote them to specific congregations or individuals, usually in response to specific circumstances or problems. And therefore they emphasize or apply specific aspects of gospel principles in response to the original situation rather than giving a general systematic theology or something of that sort. And one of the points he starts off making is that whereas the average ancient letter was only 87 words long, and the literary letters of Roman authors such as Cicero and Seneca averaged 295 and 995 words respectively, the average letter of Paul was 2,495 words long. And so within that it covers a variety of subjects, and each one addresses complex argumentation, and his letters can be therefore difficult to follow, especially in translation. So Don, what stood out to you from this article?
A couple things. One thing was that Paul was well trained in letter writing and in classical rhetoric, and so the author here goes through a lot of that, talking about how these letters were structured, what their components are, and so on. It gets pretty technical as far as that goes, but it's fascinating information. And the second thing that struck me was Paul's letters weren't written hastily. So if you have an image of him sitting down, dashing off a letter, handing it off to somebody to deliver and read to some congregation, that's not accurate. It actually took a lot of time. He employed a scribe or scribes, and they went through a lengthy, time-consuming process to get those letters written up, copied, reviewed, approved, and so on. I learned a lot that when you read one of Paul's letters where it's sometimes kind of a rapid fire with topics, that has the aspect of maybe being dictated to scribe. But then there's other sections like with the Romans where he gets into the theology of justification by faith, which obviously are very sophisticated and took a lot of time to compose, and he must have had a really good scribe to get that down, or had gone through and outlined or written it himself, then been copied by a scribe. So it's kind of fascinating to think of all the options of how you could employ a scribe, whether to simply copy, whether to edit, or whether to actually serve as a co-author with some of the letters.
Yeah, good points. Yeah, and so again, part of the title is the occasional nature, and so he, is addressing certain issues or questions or problems he's heard about, and particularly, for this week with 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, one of the major issues that he deals a lot with is the topic of the parousia, or the return of Jesus Christ, what we call the second coming. And it seems like in the first letter, when he talks about it, it was understood that he was coming back really soon. And so he had to write the second letter to kind of explain, no, there's still a lot of things that need to happen before he comes back. And so that plays into a little bit of why he wrote a second Thessalonian letter.
Right, I found it fascinating, though, that the people were expecting Christ to come really soon at that point, and Paul, like you said, at some points had to kind of tamp down that expectation because the second coming wasn't as imminent as thought, but yet, like, some people were concerned with the passage of time that it hadn't yet happened, and so he had to moderate their enthusiasm in that regard. So it gives you a picture of Paul being really bright, really on top of things, and knowing exactly how he could drive at the heart of things that were plaguing the branches of the church at that time.
Good, yeah. All right, let's talk about the second one. It's called New Testament Prophecies of Apostasy. It's by Kent Jackson, a former ancient scripture faculty member at BYU, and also comes from a Sperry Symposium volume. And he starts off making the point, if there had not been an apostasy, there would have been no need for a restoration. Latter-day Saint theology asserts that the Church of Jesus and his apostles came to an end well within a century of its formation. The doctrines which its inspired leaders taught were corrupted and changed by others not of similar inspiration. The authority to act in God's name was taken from the earth, and the Christian systems that then remained did not enjoy divine endorsement. And so that point sets up the need later on for restoration. And particularly, he's going to spend some time talking about various prophecies throughout the New Testament, but he does spend some time, again for this week, on 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 12, that talks about the apostasy. So what did you learn from this?
A lot. I was familiar with a smattering of references to the restoration, and was happy to see that Ken had selected at least 10 passages that referred to the apostasy, some of them directly, some of them more indirectly, but still full of information on that topic, which helped me kind of fortify my own position on apostasy, that there is plenty of evidence in the New Testament after all.
Yeah, talking specifically of 2 Thessalonians, he breaks down a little bit the Greek behind the prophecy. In the King James, it says a falling away, which kind of can sound like a gentle drifting.
A gradual, yeah, not the case.
But the term in Greek actually has a much stronger term, like rebellion, rejection of God, or the Great Revolt, as some English translations do it. And the two Greek words combined are histemi, or to stand, and apo, away from. So you're standing away from, or you're rebelling against. And so, he gives, I think, a little more insight into this particular prophecy as well as the others, as we mentioned in the New Testament. He kind of concludes with this thought. The foregoing scriptural passages demonstrate that Jesus and his apostles knew that the church that they headed would come to an end shortly after their generation. They bore a somber witness to that knowledge in the record that they left behind for later readers, the New Testament. All Christians who take seriously the apostolic testimony must reckon with the prophetic word of the inspired witnesses that the forces of false religion would prevail over those of the truth, and that the church which was guided by the power of the apostleship in the first century would no longer exist in the second. Our third article is Scribes and Ancient Letters, Implication for the Pauline Epistles. It's by Lincoln Blumell, an ancient scripture faculty member at BYU, and comes from a Sperry Symposium volume. And in this, he talks more about scribes, as we've already talked a little bit with Eric Huntsman's article. And he talks about the various scenarios that Paul could have employed scribes based on what we know about scribes and how they functioned in antiquity. And so he's looking at the Greco-Roman context and the normal scribal practices there. And he could have dictated word for word. He could have given a general outline, a rough draft that they polish up, etc. I'm guessing in your role as an editor, you probably appreciate some of these things that he talks about with the scribes. But what else stood out to you from this?
Exactly. Yeah, the levels of intervention kind of intrigue me. And I guess it's hard to tell how much a particular scribe influenced the form and the style, the vocabulary, and even content of Paul's letters. We don't really know that, but we have a sense that he did employ scribes, and Paul would often sign off and affirm that it was still authentically his letter, even though he had scribal help. One thing I enjoyed learning is that the scribes were used much more extensively than we might imagine. I think Blumell cites some statistics like in ancient times, illiteracy was no more than 5 or 10% of the population. And that scribes were an integral component of society at that time. And even emperors, aristocrats, and plebeians often would depend on scribes. They'd go to the marketplace, hire a scribe, and so on. And what fascinated me is that there was a big expense involved here, because when it took a lot of time, you'd have a professional scribe, and you had to rely on a professional scribe. Then there was, if the recording was on a wood tablet or on wax, at one point it had to be transferred to papyrus, was another expense. And when you told it all up, the time involved and the expense and so on, you get a good picture of the technology of the time. Was fairly time consuming. That's something I hadn't ever really thought about before.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think this article is a great one for understanding more of that context and background. And, one of the things he's also kind of bringing out that we've alluded to is, some biblical scholars identify some letters of Paul as authentic, genuine to Paul, and others they sometimes will refer to as Deutero-Pauline, or secondary to Paul, maybe written later by followers or trying to write in the style of Paul. But with the use of scribes, it's hard to simply make that separation because scribes did have a lot of impact on vocabulary structure and things of letters, even if Paul were right there dictating it to them. How they then ended up finally crafting that article or that epistle might vary. And so one of the points Lincoln Blumel made was that Paul was ultimately responsible for the letters written in his name. He checked over the final draft, as can be seen from the presence of either his subscription or postscript at the end of each letter, you mentioned that, and made sure that they accurately conveyed what he intended. Therefore, despite Paul's rather extensive use of scribes, for all intents and purposes, the letters bearing his name should be regarded as authentic Pauline letters. And, he gives some examples of how he definitely used scribes throughout many epistles and jumped in, I guess, at the end often to kind of sign off and give greetings to people and so forth.
I thought it was interesting that Blumel points out that some scholars will be skeptical over the Pauline authorship of some of the letters because of the vocabulary. Some of it's unique either to that letter or to the entire New Testament, but isn't found in other of Paul's writings. And then they'll point to, well, most of the time Paul's literary style is terse and succinct and rapidly moving through topics and so on, but then sometimes there's what they call hypotaxis, where the writer tags on subordinate clauses and makes really compound, complex sentences and so on and so forth, which is not a characteristic feature of Paul's style. But if scribes are being employed and they were professional and well-trained, articulate, good writers and thinkers and so on, and could have latitude to kind of intrude a bit on the form of the letter, that blunts the force of the scholar's arguments against Pauline authorship.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. So for this week, we have a couple of articles that really help us understand more of scribal practices and how they relate to Paul's epistles, and then a greater understanding of his prophecies about the apostasy.